Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Spitfire on My Tail, Part 5. On September the 3rd, 1936, I received my letter of acceptance to the Luftwaffe, but there were conditions. Firstly, I had to obtain my passing out marks from school. Then I would have to serve my Reichsarbeitsdienst, which was the labor service. Even after that, there would be a 6-month probation period at the military school before my appointment would become official, assuring me of a place to be trained as an officer. Despite all these problems, I was confident that I would make it. A whole new chapter of my life was about to begin. From September of 1936, my life seemed to change gear and rush forward at a pace which I hadn't thought possible. Germany was building up her armed forces, and the priorities were men and machines. This was obvious when I was given my instructions before entry to the Luftkriegsschule. There would be no time for me to sit my final examinations at school in the usual way. Instead, my results would be formulated upon the average of tests set during the earlier part of the year. This, coupled with an assessment by the class teacher, would give me a final result. I was sure I would get the required passes, but I was interested to see how the human factor affected my results. For instance, my physics teacher, who had been a flyer in the First War, gave me a grade 1, which was the best. I was good at the subject and deserved a high mark, but I often wondered if his interest in my future didn't just ease that up a bit. In contrast to this, the chemistry teacher, who had no apparent nationalistic feelings, gave me grade 4, a bare pass. I wasn't as good at chemistry as I was at physics, but I thought that I had earned better than that. Still, I told myself, what you lose on the roundabout, you make up on the swings. Overall, I qualified well enough to have been granted a spot at a university in ordinary times, but the end of 1936 was anything but ordinary for me. On my 18th birthday, September the 14th, 1936, I was automatically transferred from the Hitlerjugend to the SA. I wasn't very interested in either organization, but I did want to get the SA Sportabzeichen, which was a medal for completing sporting, shooting and marching events. Time was now short, and I wasn't to have enough to get through the whole set of tests, but I did qualify for the medal. I thought I would be able to make the SA shooting tests just before I left for my labor service, but events were to conspire against me. That, coupled with youthful naivety. The test was to be held on the Sunday before I was to leave. On the Saturday, I had agreed to have a farewell party with my mates. We were going to paint the town red. This event did not require any paint. To promote certain vintages of local wines, there had been declared a Day of Wine in Ludwigsburg. The particular wine in focus was a Brackenheimer, a light red wine made from the grapes which were grown within the district of Ludwigsburg. The price of the wine was subsidized for the duration of the promotion and presented a very cheap drink for a bunch of young people bent on having a good time. As usual, I thought I was immune from the effects of such a mundane thing as red wine and, with the willing assistance of my mates, managed to consume much too much. I don't remember how I got home, but my next experience was to wake up feeling indescribably awful. I also woke up in a bed that was saturated with partly digested red wine and other unidentified substances. Fortunately, my parents were understanding and didn't make too much of it, other than making fun of my monumental headache and hangover. And thus it was I missed the shooting section of the SA Sportabzeichen. I could no more have held and fired a rifle on that day than I could have flown unaided. I consoled myself that I would soon be doing things that were actually important to me, and I could well miss the qualifications of an organization about which I had the gravest doubts anyway. Having passed my exams, I learned that such was the urgency behind recruitment into the services that I was only to do 2 months of my 6 months Arbeitsdienst. This was good news indeed. I was straining at the leash to get into the Luftwaffe. Since passing my acceptance tests, I had thought of little else but the possibility of flying. I was impatient to make a start, and things like my labor service just seemed to be unnecessary obstructions which were being placed in my way. Still, there was no way around it, and on October the 1st, 1936, I reported to Schwäbisch Hall. Again, I was to find that corners had been cut to expedite our progress through labor service. It was normal practice for the young people who were serving their time to be sent as far across Germany as possible. The object, apparently, was that a good mix could be achieved at this important stage in a young person's life. You have to remember that it was unusual for people to have traveled around too much, even in their own country. So it was decreed that the labor service youngsters would travel to experience other parts of Germany and meet fellow Germans. It was an interesting piece of planning on the part of the government. The regional differences were still very marked in both tradition and dialect. When we moved as a family from Ochsenwang to Kreglingen, about 200 kilometers, both myself and my sister found it difficult to communicate with other children because they spoke Franconian, while we still used the lower Swabian farmers' dialect. Part of the philosophy of Arbeitsdienst was to provide a sort of cultural melting pot for the youth of Germany. Certainly, many friendships were struck up which forged strong links across the land. So, on October the 1st, I reported to Schwäbisch Hall to begin my 8 weeks of service. The quarters were in a converted barn, which had been one of the outbuildings of the Kumburg, an ancient and very robust castle perched on the top of a hill overlooking Schwäbisch Hall. The barn was a completely self-contained unit for us. Within it had been built a kitchen, a mess hall, sleeping quarters, and separate rooms for the supervisory staff. All the boys there were on their way to the various arms of the Wehrmacht, but only Werner Rauf, from Stuttgart and an aspiring infantry officer, and myself were on the short course. The staff were aware of this and ensured that we both got maximum benefit from our time by giving us every extra and unpleasant job that they could. We only did our 8 weeks, but I would hazard that the two of us did more than we would have done had we served the full time. This was relaxed a little when we formed a band which we called Arbeitsdienstkameraden. I played piano and Werner joined me on the cello. Gradually, we collected together 5 or 6 of the boys and made a nice diversion from the drudgery of the day. Ours was quite a small camp, only catering for one Arbeitsdienst company. Food was scarce, but the camp leader had on his own initiative supplemented our diet by having a kitchen garden and raising pigs on the food scraps. It didn't provide an excess of food, but at least we all had fresh vegetables and salads. Our working day was started by reveille with military-style bugle blowing at 05:30 hours. At this time of the year, of course, it was dark and beginning to get very cold. There were just 10 minutes for washing and dressing, and then it was outside in all weathers for 30 minutes of gymnastics. To really enhance the morning scene, the farmer had unloaded a dung cart of the meadow where we undertook our exercises. This didn't encourage our leaders to seek a different venue, as I suspect the farmer wanted, but merely to increase the exercises that brought us into the complete contact with the stinking ooze. After the calisthenics, we would double back to our quarters to change into our working overalls and to cram down some black bread and chicory coffee. Our wet exercise suits were hung up to drip dry beside our beds. With hardly a pause, we would be out at 06:30 hours, spades shouldered like rifles, ready for the march into town. However bad we felt in the morning, there was a certain pride in our group, and as we reached the outskirts of the small town, we would break into song, something which I enjoyed quite much. Then, with great pride and almost military precision, we would march through Schwäbisch Hall as if we were returning from some great victory instead of being on our way to dig ditches. Out of town we marched uphill to the area where we were working, which was not too far from the Luftwaffe Flughafen at Hessenthal. Our work was nothing to do with the airfield, but many was the time I found myself looking at the lumbering Dornier Do 23 bombers and wondering what it would be like to join those elite men, the flyers. I was usually brought back to earth by the sharp bark of our supervisor extolling the virtues of physical labor. Our task was to enlarge a small stream into a broader and deeper drainage culvert. The meadows on either side of the stream were very marshy, and it was hoped that if we could sufficiently improve the drainage, then the meadows would be of more agricultural use. The main problem for us was that the water could not be stopped whilst we worked, and so we were always standing nearly to the tops of our boots in water. That is not to say that our boots were waterproof either, they were just the standard issue jack boots, which are common in all of the German services. Being leather, they soon became saturated and offered no protection from the water. Really, we might as well have taken our boots off for all the water they kept out. Each of us only had the one pair, and it was left to our own ingenuity to dry them out at night prior to the next day's hard labor. I think my strongest impression on this short time was of being cold, wet, hungry, and tired all the time. I'm sure that Werner and myself did more than the others for the reasons which I have explained. Certainly, the lower-ranking Arbeitsdienstführer found us special tasks regularly. A favorite of his was searching for the angle of the slope. This involved virtually lying in the ditch to better observe the drop of the land to ensure a good flow of water. In the end, Werner and I would just fall into the water on purpose to spoil the joke. It didn't help, we got wet anyway, but at least we felt that our pride had benefited. I felt miserable, how I now longed for those happy days at school. Still, at least there were 2 of us, and it was only for 8 weeks. Those were sustaining thoughts. After the first 4 weeks, we were allowed out to the town, and things began to be a little better. However, when our 8 weeks were up, I was heartily glad to wave goodbye to that barn and my labor service. Things must get better now, I thought. There was to be no pause in my education, and the day after I returned home, I was packed and waiting on the station for the train which would start me on the first leg of my journey back to Berlin. All of a sudden, travel and new experiences had become the greater part of my life. I could feel that I was beginning to toughen up inside as well. The labor service had slimmed me down a little, and I could feel that my muscles were now in excellent tone. I felt able to face anything, but I was still a little apprehensive about actually going into the military establishment. Still, I thought, what could be harder than Arbeitsdienst? The journey from Stuttgart to Berlin took 10 hours, mainly at night. In the morning I arrived at Anhalter Bahnhof and made the change to Potsdamer Bahnhof, arriving at 11 o'clock. There was a military bus waiting for me and other new recruits. It was in the charge of a Luftwaffe soldier who was also the driver. I tried to ask him some questions, but he was very surly, almost aggressive. 2 other boys were already on the bus, and they told me to ignore him. Another train arrived, and some more recruits got on the bus. The driver tried to impress them by telling them that they were late, even though we sat and waited for another train to come before we got started. We really did look like a sad bunch of refugees, each clutching a cardboard box, not a suitcase or bag. This had been on the instructions of the Luftwaffe. Each of us was to bring a single box so that our civilian clothing could be sent home. I think we had all expected a welcome, to be made to feel important, but on the contrary, we just moved around like so many dumb sheep. At Wildpark Werder, we were all made to produce our letters of acceptance to make sure that we should be there. As if we would have traveled halfway across Germany without having the proper papers. I was getting my first insight into the slow workings of the military machine. We were told that we would be the first intake through the new center at Wildpark Werder. All the buildings were new and smelled of paint and plaster. Later, we learned that some of the buildings formed an entrance to Göring's underground command post, which was situated under an adjacent hill. Some of us wondered if we were in the right place. There were no hangars, no aircraft, just accommodation that looked like classrooms. We were plucked from our reverie as we were told to get out of the bus and line up. Quickly, you're in the Luftwaffe now. Now I really began to wonder what I had got into. In my naivety, I had thought that going into the Luftwaffe would be like going on to higher education. After all, we'd been selected from hundreds of other applicants and, by virtue of that, felt we were special already. But not to the military. Line up there. Where are your papers? You're in room 8B. Always shouting and everyone running. An NCO shouted at me to get to my room, and I ran for the stone staircase, the cardboard box under my arm. I tried to push my way through a sea of others, all with their cardboard boxes, some trying to get up the stairs, others trying to get down. At the landing, there was an NCO shouting unintelligible orders at me to get back downstairs for a reason which I couldn't catch. At the bottom, there were others shouting at us to get to our rooms. Do you not understand a simple order? Why the hell are you down here again? It was madness. Just a mass of young men pushing in either direction, all clutching desperately to their pathetic cardboard boxes. At last, a fellow newcomer told me that I should take off my tie. Apparently, the NCOs were sensitive about the nickname Schlipssoldaten that had been given to the Luftwaffe by the other services. I duly removed my tie and folded it up. Then I approached the NCO and reported, in what I thought was my best military style, Bitte Herrn Obergefreiten vorbeigehen zu dürfen. May I be permitted to pass? A curt nod of the head told me that I had solved one of the first conundrums. At that time, a lot of abstract thoughts were beginning to race up and down the staircase of my mind. Somewhere inside my head was a voice barking, Uli, what the hell have you got into? I had never liked the kind of mindless loud bullying which I had seen in the Hitlerjugend and in the SA. I have always held the view that raising your voice is an indication that you are running out of things to say. Violence is, of course, reserved for when you have completely run out of logical argument. I had thought I would be escaping from this kind of treatment once I got away from the small town atmosphere at home. It had, in fact, been this kind of brainless persecution which had led me to joining the Luftwaffe and not becoming an infantry officer cadet like my Arbeitsdienstkamerad Werner Ruf. Within the small community from which I had come, my parents had been labeled as social climbers. They had both, energetically, applied themselves to social activities and had made enemies as a result. Part of the social pressure that was brought to bear upon them was the accusation that my mother was having an affair with one of the younger teachers from the school at which my father was headmaster. Father was a member of the NSDAP, and one of his junior teachers at the school was a senior official, in fact, the Ortsgruppenleiter, which is the local party chief. Apparently, the NSDAP man felt that his position in the party entitled him to the headmastership of the school, and thus a slanderous campaign was begun with the objective of replacing my father with a more suitable and, morally, more stable person. It is incredible to think how seriously this affair was taken. In the end, father was required to face a court of honor. He was cleared, but you don't throw mud at the wall without some of it sticking. Our family name had been tarnished for no real reason, and this had resulted in my being found as unsuitable material for officer training in the infantry, a fact which indirectly saved my life, I expect. My father had become a party member, partly as a reaction to the ostracism of the established hierarchy in Kreglingen, and partly because, like so many Germans, he could see Hitler overturning the vicious and uncompromising conditions of the Treaty of Versailles and giving our country back her dignity. My mother would have joined the NS Frauenschaft, but she was of the opinion that this group had been well established around the female equivalent of the bully boy faction of society. Even in retrospect, the German people had fairly accurate views of the party leadership. Göring was a bit of a joke. His flamboyance and showmanship were seen for what they were, but the fundamental point, which many must have missed, was that despite the fact we laughed at his transparent antics, he took himself seriously. Goebbels was the master of advertising and a genius at his trade. By virtue of his position, he was also afforded some latitude in what were extreme views at the time. In close company with him was Julius Streicher, who managed the awful magazine Der Stürmer. For most, the paper represented a fanatical view and was not, therefore, much subscribed to outside the party faithful. Rudolf Hess was the deputy Führer and the party purist. From all accounts, it was he who tried always to keep the doctrines of the National Socialist as pure and uncorrupted the idealist. Over and above these individuals who formed the core of the party was Hitler himself. He had no specific talent, but an intangible abstract ability to weld the diverse aims of these individuals into a common policy. To him would fall the task of guiding their energy and in manipulating and managing the political environment to further their aims. He was a peculiar and charismatic character who, although not of impressive physical appearance or stature, had a certain magnetic quality about him. In the years to come, I was to meet him and experience this firsthand. Since that time, I have sensed it in others who were destined to become exceptional people, but never to the same powerful degree. What, unfortunately, abounded in the party was the bully boy type. This was something to do with the fact that the NSDAP was a new party on the German political scene and, to a degree, had to attract new blood in vast numbers by whatever means. This led to many outcasts from other, more established organizations becoming welcome into the party faithful. They, in turn, attracted more of their own, and so an unbalanced organization grew. I thought initially that this was the reason why I had been confronted by so many of the bullies in Arbeitsdienst and now on my first day in the Luftwaffe. But since then, I have discovered that this core of loud, seemingly ignorant people is most people's introduction to military institutions worldwide. Many servicemen in Britain remember the Welsh corporal who screamed at them from dawn to dusk, or the sergeant major who could shatter your nerves at 1,000 meters with his phenomenal voice. We had Gefreite from Saxony and an Unteroffizier who, we felt, had the power of life and death over us. That is not to be too disparaging of these groups, it is just a sort of abstract concept which is common to most servicemen's experience. I had come to Berlin thinking that I had left all the petty prejudice and bullying behind. I didn't think the bully element would exist with such strength within the military. If this first contact was anything to go by, I was hopelessly wrong. My parents tried to impress upon me that I was a talented young person with a good brain and a sound education to go with it. What I had to learn, they explained, was to be more patient and to stop requiring the world to come up to my expectations of it. I'm not sure that I've ever completely embraced that view. Whatever my immediate problems, I had to come to terms with the fact that I had signed up and that there was no easy way out. First, I had to take the 6 months infantry training and then perhaps things would change. Again, I found myself in the position of wishing a part of my life away so that I might arrive at a time which would be more fulfilling. So, I had to address myself to the immediate problems. Let's get up the stairs and then see what else the day had in store. So, military life finally begins for Ulrich, and this brings back memories for me too, but more about that in a minute. First, I want to talk about some things that we've heard about in this video, starting with the SA Sports Badge. Now, I was unfamiliar with this badge and looked it up, and oh boy, is it complex. To earn this badge, you had to complete 3 phases of tests with a total of 16 exercises or examinations. These were, in order: Phase 1, 100-meter dash, long jump, shot put, club throw, 3000-meter run. Phase 2, a 25-kilometer ruck march, shooting a 22 caliber rifle from the prone supported and prone unsupported position, and then again throwing a stick grenade-like club from the prone, kneeling and standing position while hitting a target zone. And finally Phase 3, which was basically a small-scale military training exercise that comprised target recognition, camouflage, orienteering, memorizing a report and reproducing it sometime later, range estimation and movement through terrain. All in all, that is a lot of tests and quite challenging actually. Depending on how many times you earned the badge, you could receive silver and gold versions. Equally challenging must have been Ulrich's first hangover. It's interesting to see that German parents are dealing with the first massive hangovers of their children the same way today as they have done 90 years ago. There will be ridicule, yes, but there will also be care, of course. You will also get the traditional hangover cure, which in the parts where I grew up is a so-called FISCHBRÖTCHEN, which is a fish sandwich. It's generally a white bread bun sandwich served with pickled herring, pickled cucumbers and raw onions. And no, stop it, I can see you cringing at this, but no, that shit is actually delicious and it will cure your hangover almost instantly. Anyway, speaking about hangovers, the small town where Ulrich had his drinks is Brackenheim, and even though it's very small, it's actually the biggest region of red wine production in Germany. There are 2,100 acres of vineyard there, and the small community has been making wine for over 1,200 years. Finally, talking about the first day in the service, I can say with confidence that I too had the thought of what the fuck am I doing here in my mind when I arrived for basic training. And even though I wasn't screamed at immediately, it was completely new and alien experience. Luckily enough, only a year later I was already on the other side and was screaming at the newcomers myself. Can you relate? Let me know down below, and also if you like this video, you can now become a channel member and support me and my video production. Consider checking it out. Until next time, see you then, bye bye.